Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest Red Line podcast Twitter Spaces event. My name is Francis Leach. I'm the head of breaking news with the Red Line podcast, and we're just waiting for a few more people to join us in the room before we get underway in our latest discussion here in the space, and it is today on the Wagner Group and its finances. So we might give it one more minute before we launch into this conversation. We thank you for joining us here. Wherever you are, I'm looking to you today from Tasmania in the southern part of Australia. So, I know we have people all over the world joining us. We might actually get underway now as we wait for maybe one or two other people to join us here. Let's start by introducing our experts on this particular topic as we say hello to Michael Hilliard, who is the host of the Red Line podcast, and he's one of our experts who'll be joining us in discussion on this conversation today. Hello, Michael. How are you today?
It's always good to be chatting. Always good to jump on these and be chatting about Wagner, a highly interesting subject, particularly on the financial front, where I think a lot of people miss a lot of the crimes that they commit.
Indeed. We're also joined by Matthew Sutherland, who is an open source intelligence expert with All Eyes on Wagner, the group that spend a lot in tracking and monitoring the actions of the Wagner Group. Matthew, where are we finding you today?
Hey there. Thanks so much for having me, first of all. I'm based out on the west coast of Canada right now, so bright and early for me.
Well, we
really looking forward to it.
Yeah, we appreciate you joining. The CEO of All Eyes on Wagner is with us as well. Lou, welcome to the conversation.
Hello, guys. I hope you can hear me fine. And I'm based in France right now, and I can see that we have Miles, who is going to be our challenger. I'm scared.
No, I'm okay. Sorry about that. Was me muting myself. I was just going to say we are going to be joined by Candace Rondeaux as well at some direct future frontline. So if Candace does pop up while I'm speaking, Candace is here, I think, now. So we might just make sure that they're able to speak. Candace, how are you?
She just is a listener at the moment, so I'll if she clicks the link in her DMs, that'll come through. But for now, we'll crack on and I'll sort Candace out.
Okay, so let's start, Lou. Let's start with you. And I know the history of the Wagner Group is well discussed by people in these circles, but just quickly, a quick primer for those who are coming in with limited knowledge and are interested in this topic. What is the Wagner Group, and particularly Evgeny Prigozhin, and why has he become such a prominent figure in the world at the moment, particularly with what's going on in Ukraine?
Yes, so I think actually Candace has worked a lot on how to call the Wagner Group, and I think that's very important to start with terminology, because for a very long time that has been called a private military company, but actually this is not at all the case. So the Wagner Group is I think we can say for sure that it's a criminal organization. Candace, I'm sure, will add to it as she calls it a cartel, which we quite agree with. And basically it combines, I would say, the typical Russian criminal organization mixed with Russian intelligence services. So I think that's the first point. And today we see that they are not only active as security in the security services, but as in providing security services, but they also are active in getting natural resources asset businesses. So that's what they do a lot in Africa and the Middle East. And also they have a very active part of the organization, which is involved in media production, strategic communication, influence operation. So what we see is much bigger than what is commonly reported in media on just, the military side or mercenary side.
Candace, thank you for joining us. When we hear what it is now from Lou, the Wagner Group, what did it look like when it started? I mean, they're a very sophisticated operation that Lou has outlined there with a multifaceted approach to the way way that it operates. Was it always the case, or did it start out as a more conventional mercenary operation?
Well, I think the best thing to understand about the Wagner Group is that, before it was the brand that we know today, it was basically a battlefield rumor. And it really the origin story starts way back in 2014 when there were a lot of different private military security providers, or quasi-private, working for Russia, particularly for Gazprom and Rostec, delivering weapons to Syria. And when some of those shipments were interdicted and the companies were unmasked, there was an effort to remask them, and that effort is the Wagner Group. At the time, it was a pretty ramshackle enterprise that was very ad hoc, but it certainly showed that there was investment from the Ministry of Defense and that there were connections to the Kremlin. And more importantly, that it was a key part of the Kremlin's strategy for mitigating the risk of sanctions, where embargoed sanctions imposed by the UN were in play. So that included Syria, Libya, and the Central African Republic, which at the time were all embattled and all had a great deal of difficulty because of the strongman politics that had basically destroyed those countries.
So this is basically, at its heart, an organisation which is fundamentally directed towards undermining or circumventing or doing a U-run around the rules-based order and defying the economics of the rules-based order in order to allow this case to act however he wants.
Exactly. I mean, it was essentially, what we understand to be the Wagner Group today is a brand. It's like the McDonald's of the Russian way of war, I think is the best way to describe it. If you had a big golden arches, this would, the Wagner Group would be it. It's essentially not really a unitary company. I think that's the thing that people really struggle to understand. It's a network of companies, many of which have links to Prigozhin, but not all of them service Prigozhin's empire. There are tentacles that connect those companies to Sogaz, which is a giant insurer in Russia, connects them to Rostec, which is the arms dealer. All of those sinews, those kind of interconnecting business interests, make up what we call the Wagner Group today.
Matt, it's a very complex. We've heard from both Lou and Candace here, but Prigozhin's at the centre of it, and to many people now who are casual observers of this, he's almost like a cartoon baddie, but obviously with much more serious consequences. And he's also now speaking out more directly in relation to his frustrations on the battlefield in the east of Ukraine. So give us a bit of a sense of what we understand about who he is and where he's at right now.
Absolutely. So the thing to understand a bit about Prigozhin before diving into himself is that he's absolutely very, very involved in Wagner, especially financially. But that kind of mythos of him as a puppet master of Wagner goes a long way into creating that, like Candace was saying there, that mythos that Wagner is in fact a single entity and not a full network of companies, and it kind of helps with the modicum of separation from the Kremlin, the Russian state. Prigozhin himself, from what we understand, is more or less an oligarch that started out in catering and became a close friend of Putin and started developing these contracts and kind of managed to slither his way into the inner circle there and help to act as kind of a figurehead of the Wagner Group. And right now, what we're seeing, I think, a lot in Ukraine and with the added publicity with Wagner and himself, is that he's kind of become a little big for his britches and is getting heavily involved in political discourse, especially discourse about the war in Ukraine and discourse elsewhere. You see him reaching out, calling out countries, states, organizations, whatever, that call out the Wagner Group. And it's going to be really interesting to see where that goes, because there's only so far I think he can go before he comes crashing down to earth.
Well, Michael, you've always got a good handle on the delicate balance of the geopolitics, both internationally of what's going on, but internally in Russia as well. What do you read into Prigozhin's public proclamations about the incompetence of the Russian military, the lack of ammunition that's being supplied to him and his soldiers in the field, and the comments, which can be, I guess, directly read as criticism not only of the Russian military, but by extension.
So I think a lot, Candace has brought a really good point out that Wagner is not a single operation. It's not a single person. I almost, when I talk about Wagner, we'll divide it into 4 parts. So there's kind of Wagner that operates domestically, and that can be anything from, sorting out bikers to sort of rough up protesters. There's Wagner, the kind of cannon foddery prisoners that we're seeing used in Ukraine quite often to lure out Ukrainian positions. There's also really good Wagner troops that are quite well trained, and they are, a lot of them have done, some pretty heavy operational work in Syria. And there's also the guys that operate through Africa, through Mali, through Sudan, who are a completely different kettle of fish to all 3 of those. So, it is a very, very complex organization, a very complex balance between them. But I think the interesting thing domestically for Putin on this one is just the public view of Wagner. And it's speaking to sort of Russians on the ground, they are very annoyed by the amount of, conscripts and soldiers who have died in the war in Ukraine. But the moment you say, well, what do you feel about the Wagner casualties, these prisoners, these mercenaries? There's just not that same level of annoyance about it. They keep getting this, they're murderers, they're prisoners, they're X and Y, who cares? So it has mitigated a lot of this sort of flashback in some of these battles that have cost a lot of Russian lives.
I think also, if I can add something, is we talk a lot about the military, which obviously that's what matters today in Ukraine. But the Wagner empire at large, it has also been employing a lot of civilians. And if you look at countries, like the Central African Republic, today you see a big number of civilians that have been employed either a bit more permanently or, from a contract basis, and they have worked with a lot of subcontractors. So if you look at all the natural resources exploration that has been done today in Syria, in CAR, that has been done hand to hand with, I would say, subcontractors. So they do as well provide jobs. Some of them are very well paid. And I really liked some of the papers that were released this week by Candace team, where we really talk as well about that mythology or that branded image of a romantic soldier who is fighting abroad. And I think that is very, very powerful in some domestic circles.
Candace, Lou's just mentioned there the global footprint of the Wagner Group, and particularly its presence in Africa, and it has an extensive network of on-the-ground operations in Africa. Can you give us, before we talk specifically about Africa, can we zoom out a bit and talk about its global, its entirety? Just how many countries do we believe Wagner is operating in, and how wide does its reach spread?
I think the important thing to understand is that wherever Rostec has an agreement through its relationship with the Russian government to provide arms and military services to a country, there goes the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group really, in many ways, is the security arm of Rostec, and it is the security arm of Rosneft and Tatneft, and Gazprom. So when we talk about it, it's really important to understand what we're talking about is the security enterprises of those state-run companies. Wherever they are, that's where you'll find the so-called Wagner Group. So what does that mean? Well, they have a huge presence in Africa because of this long history between the former Soviet Union and African nations, particularly in the Francophone and Portuguese-speaking parts of Africa. There's a long history there of cultivating anti-colonialist or anti-European colonialist sentiment and leadership and so forth and so on. And what we've seen over the last, maybe decade or so is an attempt to kind of revive those old relationships, and with some success. Clearly, in CAR and places like Libya, there has been some success there. Mali now also there seems to be some success. But they're present in Venezuela. They are actually present in Cuba. They're present in Nicaragua. They have bases all over the world, again, wherever there are military technical agreements in place between Russia and a given government. So their networks are quite extensive. They reach as far as Indonesia. There's almost really no place in the world, with the exception of North America and certain parts of Latin America, that is untouched by the Wagner Group.
Michael, can we just speak a little bit from your perspective about how nation states then deal with the threat of the Wagner, the way that it operates? Because it is such a strange hybrid beast, and it's obviously very, very difficult to counteract them in the manner in which the organisation has been set up.
So yes and no. Obviously, when the Wagner Group were directly engaging with US forces in Syria, the US did not hesitate to sort of blow them out of the water. But when it comes to the Central African Republic, they're often far better aimed than the local forces. They're probably more trained than some of the local forces. And for a local ruler, they can effectively trust them more than some of the local forces. I mean, a lot of the dictators in Africa have been taken out by their own bodyguards over the years, and by hiring Wagner, it kind of gives an outside force for protection. For Russia, it allows them to market themselves as an alternative to the sort of the US or Western powers, where back in the Cold War, we used to be able to go, will I side with the US or will I side with Russia? And Russia's trying to regain that and offer it a sort of direct security to some of these leaders. They tend not to engage with national forces, although when they have done, places like Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, it's not gone too well. But generally, if they are going to, the times they have engaged US forces, it has not gone particularly well for Wagner.
This is a very expensive thing to be doing. And Lou, I want to direct this question to you. So how is this financed? And this is the crux of what we're discussing here today. How is this financed? And is it driven by a thirst for the resources in the countries in which it operates?
Well, actually, I'm not too sure about that, to be honest, for many reasons. So today it's very difficult to understand how much is made out of the natural resources assets that they have, for the simple reason that they are operating assets which have a high level of, could be really trafficked. So today, when we investigated the diamond business, for instance, we found out that only a very small part is officially sold outside of CAR, and we can trace that a little bit, but that's very small. It's like around 900,000 euros, or like $900,000 something like that. So it's very small, and obviously it does not account for the reality of the volume of diamonds that they have to trade. So it means that a huge part of what they do is likely smuggled or trafficked, and that makes it very difficult to account for. Now, when we look at the top of Prigozhin's company, so the one where he's a direct shareholder in, and if you look at the period 2014-2021, which is roughly when the name Wagner started to emerge, you come to a level of revenue which is also, very small. So we calculated something like around 630 million euros for that period. But it's very small. It's about 100 million per year, basically. So that's a bit weird. So definitely that part really escapes us. And the understanding that we have is that the financing of those operations, of Wagner operation, it must come from somewhere else, and that somewhere else must be the Russian state, basically.
Matt, just how hard is it to get a handle on what the money flows are, where the money's going, where it's coming in and where it's going out? As we just heard from Lou there, it's very opaque, but has anyone been able to understand what the finances look like and what the pattern of financial behaviour is?
Not in terms of dollars and cents, like Lou touched on quite a bit there. There's stuff you can gather just from a superficial observing. Obviously, there's significant Russian involvement and investment, both in terms of logistics, equipment, et cetera, et cetera. There's not a chance they can afford everything there. In terms of actually tracking the exports and the dollars and cents made by a lot of these natural resource investments, these other companies, whether that's in Madagascar, CAR, Mali, Libya, etc., is almost impossible because, as Lou hit the nail on the head, it's not reported in a large sum. A lot of it's, especially in terms of the raw materials, are smuggled out. What we can do is kind of trace the network of companies that can make actual concrete links to, as Candace mentioned earlier, state-run companies within Russia. You can trace these, whether it's shipping manifests, corporate registries, individuals of note. So there is kind of a faint dotted line that does trace it directly to companies involved directly with Prigozhin and the Russian state. But it's incredibly, incredibly difficult to actually quantify the amount done there.
So, Candace, these companies must be dealing with other companies in Western countries and elsewhere where there sort of mean the financial exchange is going on. And the companies that are dealing with Wagner entities must know to some extent that they are dealing with an organisation that is involved in this sort of activity. So where is the compliance or the regulation regime at to make sure that they aren't being enabled by companies that are turning a blind eye?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I would just point out that asking the question, how does the Wagner Group make its money is a little bit like asking the question, how does Ronald McDonald make money? Right? I mean, you really have to kind of remember that this is a branding mechanism more than anything. And so the better question to ask is like, how does corporate McDonald's, right, make its money? And under Russian law, there's been a lot of talk about, how under Russian law, Article 359 prohibits Russian citizens from fighting abroad in conflicts where Russia is not implicated, right? So this is the so-called anti-mercenary law. The reality is there are other laws on the books. There's been a bit of an overfocus on Article 359. But one set of laws particularly allows the Ministry of Defense, and this is going way back to the 1990s, to take a portion of profits from oil and gas exploitation in countries where they're operating. And this is it was an old solve for the problem of trying to keep a military industrial complex that was very, very top heavy still in place at a time when there was very little money flowing into Russia. This, obviously after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that law is still in place. And so technically under Russian law, whenever the Ministry of Defense signs off on the deployment of a group of security actors, doesn't matter if we call them the Wagner Group or Moran Security or RSB Group or Reddit, these other brands that we've heard about, they are the ones who are kind of generating funds for the Ministry of Defense. So the profit line actually goes, it's not a dotted line. It's actually a very direct line. And it is entirely traceable if you understand how Russian law works. So that's the tricky part in terms of compliance, to answer your question, Michael. Unfortunately, what's happened over the last 30 years is that really most of kind of the analysis that is produced in the West on Russia tends to focus on the personalities and, the kind of shantytown institutions that stand in for the government, that is the Duma and the presidency. The reality is, of course, there have been a lot of executive orders issued by Putin, and the Duma itself has also passed a lot of legislation that allows for the military-industrial complex of Russia to become kind of the primary engine of the entire country's economy. Once you understand that, it becomes very easy to point to the different subsidiaries of Gazprom and Rostec, and there are hundreds of them, I just want to mention, and say, oh yes, this subsidiary has a relationship, over here in Seychelles. We can see that. And I will also say, of course, it is, I think, correct that the U.S. has categorized what we call the Wagner Group as a transnational organized crime group. It allows you to start to understand and uncover and look under the hood of this giant, massive money laundering enterprise. One other thing that's important to understand more recently is that there are a lot of digital currency transfers being deployed by different elements of the mill bloggers milieu that supports the Wagner Group's online brand. And we've seen, hundreds of millions of dollars flowing in digital currency to these wallets. So they're starting to get very creative about what they're.
Hello? I just would like to add a little bit to that and be very concrete and maybe explain a little bit how we work. So for us, because I think it's gonna add some points to the discussion. So for us, we look at we try to answer very concrete question. So when today, for instance, it is reported that the Wagner Group own oil field in Syria, it means one thing, and it's very basic. It means that those oil and gas titles, so the fact of owning the land or owning the field for a period of time, it must be reported somewhere, whether we cheat or we don't cheat, and it must be owned by a company. And so this is what we are going to look. And what we are trying to build is an org chart where we're going to see appear some companies that have, several roles or that act in several jurisdictions. And we look at what could be the valuation of that field. So for instance, because that can be calculated, it can be roughly evaluated. So I will give a very precise example. Today, it has been reported, I think 1 or 2 years ago, that the Block 1, which is an oil and gas block in Syria, was awarded to a Prigozhin affiliated company, which is Capital LLC. So that block, you can calculate how much roughly it's going to generate. And that means that it appears on the account and the balance sheet of Capital LLC. And so today, this is what we are trying to track. And we are trying to identify those companies where the money or the assets end up, on. And I think that's very concrete work. And today, the question we have is really when we look at the valuation or what the potential of each business they have. So for instance, the wood business, the diamond business, the oil and gas field in Syria, which are very difficult to sell since it's in a sanctioned country, we see that there is a disconnect between what is on the balance sheet of those companies, which belong to Prigozhin, and the reality of the valuation. So today there is a gap there. The second thing that we know from the investigation, and again, it's very concrete work, is that often there are some agreements that are done at the level of the project directly with a Prigozhin-affiliated company. So when we look at Bois Rouge or we look at Midas Resource, which is the company that owns the Endacima mining company, there are some financial arrangements that are made, which again increase the value of the assets. So they are not going to pay tax, for instance, on export. They will not have custom duties. They will have loans that are kind of given or banking guarantee that are given a bit for free, so they don't have to advance the money. So that's very important. Some of those deals we have noticed that they are done not only I would say Prigozhin company to the local government, but they are done Russian government to Syrian to foreign government. So it's the case of Syria where there have been government to government agreement on loans, and the beneficiary of those loans are Russian companies, and one of them is Europolis, which is a Prigozhin company. So we see that there are those arrangements. We see as well that they recycle money all along the Prigozhin web of network of companies. So we have famous ones like Broker Expert, for instance, which is going to repay intra-company loans to other Prigozhin company, which then will give that money to another, again, Prigozhin company. So we see that money being recycled. But it's very, very difficult to have a very good understanding of, at the end of the day, where the money is going, how it is consolidated, all of that. The second point I want to make clear is, why do we do that? Because when we have soldiers that we send abroad, or mercenaries, or fighters, we need to pay them. And as you and me, a lot of them, they receive a salary slip. And that salary slip, again, sits in one company. And that makes it very interesting because, for instance, we have Police, which not only owns mining titles, but they also have salary slips. And if we think later of, legal proceeding, that kind of information is going to be key. So that's a little bit how we look at things. But for sure, what Candace is saying around then the overall participation of the state is fairly logical.
Very complex. But yes, Candace, go ahead.
Let me just jump in here. Also, just say that the work that Lou and the folks at All Eyes on Wagner, I think, is like one of the best examples of exactly how a compliance officer trying to understand the challenge of tracing the money where the Wagner Group is concerned. Really, I think they've done such an excellent job, and I think that very concrete approach is really important to emphasize. There are some additional pieces that are probably not as well known. I'll just give you one example. Evropolis, before it was Evropolis, as we know it today, which is a Prigozhin company, was an insurance company. And one thing to understand about insurance in Russia is it mostly, for the most part, is dominated by like only 3 or 4 companies, and all of them are state-owned. And historically speaking, the KGB back in the Soviet times used to use the exact same methods that we are now seeing that Lou just described, where you have this kind of laundering trail. You can see it, right? You can see the salary slips and so forth and so on for individual fighters, but you can't really make sense of it. And this has been going on for decades and decades and decades. The same methods are being used, but there are some signatures here. I'm going to give you an example of a signature. We've heard of the company M Invest. This company is implicated in all kinds of deals that have been traced by the All Eyes on Wagner folk, myself, and others. And interestingly, that format, M Invest, is a format that was used by the KGB during the collapse of the Soviet Union, so 1989 to 1990. When the KGB understood that there was going to be a problem with Communist Party assets and money, they created these different companies. One was called A Invest, right? Just as an example. There's K Invest, and it all typically redounds to a directorate within the KGB. I would not be at all surprised to find that M Invest, in some way or another, corresponds to some echelon of the FSB or some part of the intelligence services of Russia.
I think this is so interesting because you see another very, very interesting Prigozhin company that I think we all like very much, called Broker Expert. And Broker Expert is quite known because it has become the kind of procurement key entity for Wagner operation, or I would say industrial operation abroad. So today they are the one which appear on bill of lading to send industrial equipment to Sudan, to Car and other places. And so they kind of make possible, the mining operation and all of that. But Broker Expert, before being known for that procurement role, is actually a loan and credit broker. And their main job, this is how they started, and this is how they even advertise themselves for some time, is being a kind of bank, basically. So it's very interesting that Yevropolis has the same background.
Matt, can I just bring you in here to talk a little bit about, we're hearing from Candace and from Lou and from Michael about the hybrid economics of the Wagner Group, and it's the fact that it is basically a huge enterprise making a lot of money. What is its motivation in Ukraine other than a nationalistic one for the Russian state? Because or is that also part of its enterprise? This is also part of its way of making cash, or is this a traditional mercenary operation where they're actually serving the interests of the Russian state?
That's a very complex question that could take us a whole other hour to answer. But I think in general, I would say there's a pretty distinct line between Wagner's activity elsewhere and Wagner's activity in Ukraine currently from 2022 onwards. Not in terms of that they're separate entities, in terms of their behavior and their goals and their actual modus operandi there is very, very different. Like you say, they are effectively an arm of the state there. And from my perspective, it is more of a brand building exercise for them in terms of, you see it with they're trying to cultivate that gruesome, hyper masculine perception there. And that's working wonders for them in terms of building that brand, as Candace keeps saying there, in terms of recruiting more and more young men and, people from elsewhere and former Soviet bloc countries. If you're comparing, it's like comparing apples and oranges. In Africa and elsewhere, they're really, really working to exert influence and gain access to natural resources, build wealth, and kind of spread that Russian network of influence. Whereas in Ukraine, it's a little bit of a necessity. They're getting all these benefits from the Russian state elsewhere prior to the invasion of Ukraine, and now they effectively have to help that to maintain that relationship. And you don't really see a lot of the same behavior, partially because it's open warfare, whereas elsewhere it's a lot more guerrilla warfare.
So Michael, is that brand building exercise for Wagner, as Matt pointed out, actually working for the Wagner Group in Ukraine at the moment, given the lack of success on the battlefield?
I mean, it depends on who your target audience is. Obviously, on Telegram channels, Prigozhin is very popular. Particularly in sort of the Central Asian, very hyper masculine channels. Yeah, he appears like a rash all the time. And there obviously is always people going to be talking about him possibly getting more involved in politics afterwards. As a Russia can throw men at the problem, that is getting the message across. But it's not probably having the world-changing opinion that Putin would likely hope for. But again, it's a very different operation. The brochure that Putin would be sending to Sudan is very different to the brochure he'd be, trying to put out as Wagner in Ukraine. Kind of jumping, expanding on some of the other points that we just went through. One of the great things about Wagner's finances is it is mostly in resources, and as we've covered on the show before, when you deal in resources, it is really easy to launder stuff. When you put diamond restrictions on CAR, then all of a sudden a diamond industry pops up in South Sudan next door, and they put the diamonds there and say they're from there. We saw effectively, particularly through Alrosa, which is the largest Russian diamond company, who again, that's run by Sergei Ivanov, who's been very close with Putin for a long time, where there was this kind of, you could trade diamond for helicopters or whatever you need, and everything gets laundered. Obviously, in May, that Alrosa was sanctioned, and everyone patted themselves on the back for that. But we also saw a lot of those diamonds ending up in the Indian diamond trade, in the Emirati diamond trade, and we know that some of those diamonds will be coming from Wagner as well. So again, when you trade in resources, it's really easy to lump the resources you get from an operation inside another company or inside of the country and declare it as, well, these are Emirati diamonds, Indian diamonds, or whatever. And the money becomes really clean, which makes tracking all this even harder. So I really take my hat off to both Candace and All Eyes on Wagner, because it's not an easy task to even start to unpack how complicated some of these finances are around Wagner.
Candace, can you talk to us about whether you've been able to conventional Western corporations or businesses that are clearly operating with Wagner in the full knowledge of what they do and how they achieve their resources and their wealth?
Well, I want to be careful about what I say because, I don't want to libel anybody or defame anybody. I will say that I think there are a lot of different connections between, I wouldn't say working with Wagner. I would just sort of say benefiting from Wagner's enterprises is probably the better way to put it. And I certainly think that there are types of companies that benefit from this kind of illicit trade. Chief among them are commodities brokers, large-scale commodities brokers. As an example, I will just call out for a historical example that I think would be very easily transferable to the Wagner case. In 2012, the Moran Security Group, which is a Russian PMSC, a private military security company, that has its registration in Belize, but is known, of course, to have connections to Rostec through a series of shell companies, they had a ship that was taken off the coast of Nigeria by the Nigerian Navy, and it was stopped because it was accused of being a floating arsenal. This, of course, was some sort of bribery scheme involving the Nigerian Navy and Nigerian authorities, and I think probably a rival company, maybe a British company, I was told, that essentially stopped this boat of the Moran Security Group mercenaries and took them, detained them on charges of gun running. It turned out that in actual fact, they were helping to deliver supplies, and they were involved in an oil bunkering scheme that tied back to Rosneft and a couple of other companies, and a Nigerian oil company that's very well known. How do I know this? Well, because one of the heads of the Nigerian oil company and we had a great long conversation many years ago about this schema. And he had a lot of documentation showing that Glencore, which is a very large global commodities broker, had insisted to the shipping company involved, Sovcomflot, that it do everything in its power to bribe, Nigerian authorities to release these. I think it was 18 men or something like that. So that's just one example of kind of the Wagner Group follies before there was a Wagner Group. I would not be at all surprised to find, and I think there probably is plenty of evidence to show that where there's oil bunkering or sort of illicit trade in commodities, some companies like Glencore, Gunvor, which of course is connected to Gennady Timchenko vis-a-vis his prior ownerships in the company, I would submit that those are the types of companies that tend to benefit. And they obviously are largely based in the West. Glencore has, of course, operations out of Switzerland, and Gunvor, of course, operates out of Sweden primarily. So, in Finland, I think the one thing to understand is that the folks who are kind of at the back of this entire enterprise, people like Gennady Timchenko, Sergei Chemizov, who is, of course, the head of Rostec. They have been very careful to create enough insulation for themselves through this kind of chain of companies that Lou and her team have been looking at for some time now.
So on our side, we try to identify who could be the potential clients of Bois Rouge. So Bois Rouge is specialized in timber operations, selling exotic timber, and that's something we never managed to do. Unfortunately, we don't have an answer to that. But there are two thoughts around that. The first one is, obviously, they are going to trade some of those natural resources on places where it's easy to trade and where it's easy to circumvent any regulatory, measures or any sanction. And those places, as Michael mentioned them, they are often, Dubai Commodity Exchange or Diamond Exchange or Indian Commodity Exchange or Diamond Exchange. So I think, they are going to go where it's basically easier to sell. The second thing that we have had in mind for some cases when we investigated is we have noticed that even if the Wagner Group is, very famous and that there have been plenty of information around it, when they create company, they obviously still try to conceal who is the ultimate beneficiary. And we do believe that in some cases, it could be rather hard, or it could be, a bit difficult to perform any due diligence, basic, like what every company would do in terms of corporate due diligence. And therefore, some of them could actually not know that they are trading with the Prigozhin affiliated company. So that's also what we had in mind, and I think that's remained true.
Yeah, there's no AGM for the Wagner Group, so there's no accountability, that's for sure. Just to finish with you, Matt, I'll ask you one more question, and I might go back to Candace for a final comment. Given how complex this is, do you think anybody has a real roadmap as to just how much interest Wagner has and where it actually sits, or is it sort of like grown in a sort of strangely organic way that maybe even outruns the people who originally conceived and operated this organisation?
I think it's a bit of both. So one of the huge benefits of this increased attention in the Western media and policymakers and everywhere on the Wagner Group is there's a whole metric more people with their eyes on the group, pardon the pun, but you're a lot more people looking into it, and we're starting to see more and more really, really quality investigations. So that's from the New American Team, Financial Times, Washington Post, elsewhere, producing some really fantastic investigations that's revealing a lot more than we previously saw. So I think it's partially that, which is, so yes, in terms of that, we can start identifying more and more. On the flip side, they are growing exponentially, and new companies are popping up all over the place. You see it in Sudan with Mero Gold that's rebranded about 8 or 9 times, which makes it even more intentional to try and track the actual group and the intermediaries and the, like Lou just said, the ultimate beneficiary. So I think the more we start to identify these kind of bigger companies and track those, like the M Invests, the broker experts, the easier it's going to be to identify those smaller ones. So like I just said, it's really, really easy for Wagner to register, a diamond company like in CAR or in Sudan, South Sudan, etc. It's a lot harder for them to manufacture these links between Russia and the intermediaries like the M Invest, the Everpolis. So that's kind of the epicenter, I would say, in terms of tracking these smaller, more boots on the ground kind of companies.
And just to finish, Candace, because we are out of time, it's been a fascinating, gone longer. But let's take it back to the power of the personalities involved here, because the continuity of the Wagner Group, beyond the lifespan of Prigozhin and Putin, it's hard to understand. It's hard to understand how the Russian state, as it is, for instance, there is any sort of sense of continuity after all power is invested in the leader. Is that the same for Wagner, or is this like a bushfire now that's running wild that will continue beyond the times that we live in?
That's a good question. I think we can say that Yevgeny Prigozhin now is a liability for Vladimir Putin. Whether he will cast it that way or not is another question. But right now, we already see that the kind of infighting between Prigozhin and Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, as well as Chief of Army Staff, Valery Gerasimov, that infighting is becoming more public. It certainly is having, I think, a psychological impact on perception at home in Russia of what's going on with the war, at least amongst a certain slice of Putin's fan base, and particularly, obviously, amongst the ultranationalists. It's causing infighting. So, right now we already see that Prigozhin is becoming a political liability. In the longer term, in terms of brokering a ceasefire with the Ukraine, should that ever happen in the near term, I don't think so. But if it does happen, there will be questions that the Ukrainians will raise, without doubt, about, what about the Wagner Group? When are you going to get them to stop operating on our territory? What guarantees can you give us? And we want, Yevgeny Prigozhin's head on a platter is probably going to be the demand of Kyiv. And at that stage, Putin will have to make a very hard decision. And I think that's, in some ways, what we're seeing is the decision has been made, right? The kind of the creeping marginalization of Yevgeny Prigozhin certainly suggests that Putin is aware that Prigozhin has become a liability. But it doesn't mean the Wagner Group, as we understand it, goes away. It just means it maybe gets a different brand. There's this work to now kind of spin the narrative that the Ministry of Defense is trying to subsume it, or take it over. So we should probably expect to see more and more, more battlefield losses in Ukraine stacks up to, a loss of cachet for Prigozhin, and probably a little bit more emphasis on officializing what we know as the Wagner Group.
Candace, Lou, Matt, thank you so much for being part of our conversation today. It's been fascinating, and I'm sure we'll be doing this again soon. And Michael Hilliard, the host of the Redline podcast, thank you too. And this particular conversation will be available via the Redline podcast website and YouTube channel, and also we'll post it a Twitter feed as well. So that you can listen back and share with other people who you know might be interested in it. My name is Francis Leach. I'm the head of breaking news at the Redline podcast. Thank you for being with us in our Twitter Spaces event. I'll let you know when our next one is happening. But for now, I'm going to say goodbye and have a great day.